Marine, Recon Marine, Martin, everybody. I'm going to get to you, I promise. John, go through and find out who's got to go the quickest right now, and I'll jam a few in, then we'll go to Nomi Prinz, and we'll get to the others, I promise. I will go to you while she's on with us. In fact, I'll just bring her on, introduce her, get her take on things, take your calls, okay? Monday through Friday, from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Central, we are here live. We're back Sundays, 4 to 6 p.m. History is repeating itself. The Republic is, for all intents and purposes, dead politically and in government. Fraud, media manipulation, Ron Paul having the polls cheated, caught over and over again, election fraud all over the country. People say, well, then why have Ron Paul run? To show the fraud, to inject the real issues. You don't expose the fraud by just standing back. You got to attack every angle so that as things implode, people know who to blame. Now, I know that we've got Martin's first, and then Ironhead, Cole, Phillip, Recon Marine, and others, because we're getting everybody's take here. We're going to get Nomi Prinz's take, too, on indefinite detention passes. It has now passed 93-7, into posse comitatus, military on the streets. They've been quietly violating the law for a long time. Now the dam's going to start breaking. But Nomi Prinz, I don't know, back in the 2002, 2003, went public. She was a managing director at Goldman Sachs, spoke out about the derivatives fraud, the corruption, wrote best-selling books. She's a guest here from time to time. She's got a new novel out dealing with the Great Depression that dovetails what's basically we're about to go into here. And she joins us today, but we'll also be going to your calls here. But I want to get her take on what's happening with the police state and then what's happening in Europe and this giant power grab that we're witnessing. Nomi Prinz, thanks for being on with us.
Thanks a lot, Alex.
Wow, so it's all happening. A breakdown, what's happening financially right now from your expert view and what the next dominoes are to fall.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this week that as we've been talking about, as I've been writing about, and some others, not enough, obviously, that the Fed basically stepped in to supposedly bail out Europe. That's a very, very simplistic and really wrong way of looking at what the Fed did. What the Fed did was use what it called a rescue package for Europe in order to basically rescue, again, U.S. banks that have had exposure to Europe through a massive increase in derivatives, in leverage, in all sorts of trades, where they basically dared European government after European government to try and deal with them. And as things were falling apart, the Fed stepped in. They looked at the positions of companies like Goldman Sachs, and I believe there were conversations that happened. We don't know about them. These things come out, years later, the calls that happened between the Fed, the Treasury Department, the major bank CEOs. But what we know from the results is a lot of potential money came out, again, in the guise of helping Europe, but also and only to help the U.S. banks who are looking at losing money through the very bets they placed on Europe. And so yet again, just like we had in the subprime crisis, these banks create these crazy toxic securities, assets, derivative transactions. They've increased their derivative transactions by 20% just from last year to this year. But going into the subprime crisis, same thing. They do bad bets, and they get bailed out by the Federal Reserve and the sort of backup of the Treasury Department. And it's just happening again. It's manifesting in Europe. I believe this is something that's continuing around the globe, which is why I think we're in a multi-year depression, and will manifest itself through Asia. We'll go through Latin America. We'll come back to the United States. But it's all for the same reasons, that we are bailing out bad bets by U.S. banks, printing money through the Federal Reserve, and being backed by the Treasury Department's philosophy for this.
Nomi, I've noticed that, well, in the case of Corzine and MF Global and others, the former head of Goldman Sachs, they're making 40-to-1 bets in things and engaging in more derivatives, as you said, more than they were in 2008. So they're continuing the same behavior that got the world in this situation. And the bigger the crisis gets, the more power they get to fix the problem they created.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, the Corzine situation, and, he still has misplaced billions of dollars. He's still not even been indicted for anything, which is insane. I mean, not just for betting against various sovereigns, countries in Europe, but also for misplacing, the money that was trusted for whatever reason, but trusted to MF Global to be segregated from his own bets. And that obviously didn't happen. But you're right. There's this daring, and it happened here. It's happening in Europe. And the reason it's happening more larger now, and why the derivatives positions are bigger now than they were before the first set of bailouts after the 2008 crisis, is because banks saw, hey, you know what, we can do whatever we want. We will get bailed out. We will get 0% loans to do other transactions. And that's exactly what they did. They dabbled in commodities for a little bit, did a lot of volatility, a lot of chaos in the commodities market. But then they said, you know what, a better place to do this is in Europe. And they went from country to country. They increased their bets against countries as they went from Ireland to Greece to Italy to Spain, under the cover of the main media saying, oh, these economies are just falling. Just like the U.S. economy supposedly just fell, as if it wasn't pushed to fall by the fact that we're printing money to save the bets of banks. And it's the exact same thing. It's on a bigger scale now. It's more global, as the financial community is global anyway. And there's more governments involved. But it's the same game, same rules for them, just different trades.
So where do we go from here? What's going to happen next?
Well, the markets definitely loved the fact that the Fed, coordinated this, this action with the ECB, Bank of England, and so forth, because they like cheap money. And they like to know, and bank stocks rallied on this as well, that whatever muck, whatever dirt, whatever bad transactions, whatever risk is on the books of these banks, it will be taken care of. So what happens? The banks go in, they leverage more, they bet bigger, because they just got, a really nice present instead of a smack in the face and a breaking up of their size. So I think that continues to happen. I was looking at what's going on, for example, in China. JP Morgan Chase has had a lot of sort of ads, but really articles / ads in some of the China daily papers saying, we're coming here. 30% of their profits are international. And again, when we say profits, we could mean derivative bets that get backed by central banks. But that's what they're saying. They're opening more communications, betting bigger there, because they've noticed that Europe, the game might be almost over. They bet big. They've got it sustained. They've got it backed. And so now where's the next place to go? And the next place to really go is Asia. Europe will continue to play itself out, I think, over the next year or so. But they're really gearing up to say, okay, well, we're going to move around the globe, and that's what's happening. I read an article, actually, that was in a student newspaper in Syracuse, because there's a bunch of JP Morgan officials telling them that the place to be right now is China and Asia, because China and India, because that's where they are focusing their growth. Meanwhile, and it's not really in the news, they're firing people here.
Well, that's been the globalist admitted CFR, Trilateral Commission plan, for at least 30 years, is to destroy our countries financially, suck everything out of them, and then move to China and other areas in Asia. And so while all this is happening, we see them now in Europe creating austerity, taking over the countries, and the controlled media never really points out that most of this debt that we're being told Americans and Europeans owe isn't even their debt, it's the derivatives. So you worked at Goldman Sachs at the highest levels. What is the strategic planning? I mean, obviously they have to have an end game to this. It's not just about making money, because the central banks issue the currency and credit. It's about political power. So what is their end game in this overall strategy? And because they've spent decades getting their operatives into every major regulatory and government executive position, is that why they're so openly criminal? Because they literally can do whatever they want?
They are doing whatever they want. The difference now, or the increased difference now over the last 30 years or so, is not only, for example, does Goldman have people, running Italy and running Greece and, running the European central banks, but that they're also the growth of the derivatives market. has increased so much and has accelerated so much. First, since the 2008 crisis, when banks realized they could do whatever they wanted anyway and get away with it anyway, and they piled on positions because they had all this cheap money. They had all this 0% money from the Fed. That's why the U.S. banks are leading this degradation across the globe, because they had the cheap money first, and they got it from the Fed, from the Treasury Department. And where do? They bet with it. The derivatives market that has grown by 20% just in the last year. The credit derivatives market. When I wrote that book, when I wrote Other People's Money, the credit derivatives market was tiny. It was nascent, and right now it's a $32 trillion market, which has a lot more risk attached to it. The entire derivatives market is $707 trillion. That's many GDPs over, and what it really is controlled by just a few banks. 4 banks in our country, right, control 95% of derivatives. They control $249 trillion worth of risk.
From your research,
massive.
From your research, break down who's at the top of the pyramid. The 4 big U.S. banks, the 2 or 3 big European ones.
Yeah, well, the 4 big U.S. banks, there's J.P. Morgan Chase, which is the top, and then sort of tied for second, third, and fourth is Citibank, Bank of America, and Goldman. But what no one really looks at is how many assets these banks really have, which is, deposits, loans, things with real physical assets attached to them, our money, for example. And J.P. Morgan Chase has over $1 trillion worth of assets, and they have about 5 or 6 times that in derivatives. Now, Goldman Sachs, which is just kind of a fourth in that top 4, they only have $88 billion of assets. They have $48 trillion of derivatives, meaning that's 7% of global derivatives. J.P. Morgan Chase is 11%. The other 2 are around those figures as well. So you're talking about a few banks really controlling massive parts of the derivatives market globally. I don't have the figures, but you have SocGen, you have UBS, you have Deutsche Bank, and they're probably somewhere also within that 7% to 11 to 10% range. And then there's several other banks throughout the world that are sort of 1 to 2%, and then everybody else has crumbs off of this derivatives project.
Sure. What about the article I saw in USA Today a month ago that $79 trillion in derivatives has been moved by Bank of America over into a taxpayer-backed account, and they may want a bailout of that?
Well, that's exactly right. Bank of America, as we know, is an insolvent bank. Yeah, we know, i.e. you and me and a lot of your audience. But what happened is that Merrill Lynch, which had a massive derivatives book to begin with, that's why it was going to go bankrupt in the fall of 2008. What happened was it was run by John Thain, who was an old Goldman Sachs co-president, and the Fed and Treasury Department said, hey, you know what? How about instead of you dissolving, we just give you to Bank of America, whatever. We'll just back you. And so Bank of America took Merrill Lynch. Obviously, it had Countrywide as well, which is a toxic company, and is still undergoing tons of fraud and all sorts of criminal investigations by attorney generals, not so much by the government outside of that. But anyway, Merrill Lynch had all these derivatives that were just festering. And I wrote about this in It Takes a Pillage. And what happened was in the last month is that the shareholders and the derivatives partners of Merrill Lynch said Bank of America had just gotten downgraded. That meant that Bank of America wasn't as credit worthy to be on the other side of the derivatives transactions with their customers, the big other banks. And so what we want is the Merrill Lynch stuff to at least move into the part of Bank of America that is more credit worthy. Okay, so there was the part that was more speculative, that was downgraded. The big part where all of the people's deposits and loans are was also downgraded, but not as much. So all the Merrill partners said, you know what, can you just move it over?
Philip, Recon Marine, and others, because we're getting everybody's take here. We're going to get Naomi Prince's take, too, on indefinite detention passes. It has now passed 93-7 in deposit comitatus, military on the streets. They've been quietly violating the law for a long time. Now the dam's going to start breaking. But then why have Ron Paul run? To show the fraud, to inject the real issues. You don't expose the fraud by just standing back. You got to attack every angle so that as things implode, people know who to blame. Now, I know that we've got Martin's first, and then Ironhead, Cole. We are here live. We're back Sundays 4 to 6 p.m. History is repeating itself. The Republic is, for all intents and purposes, dead politically and in government. Fraud, media manipulation, Ron Paul having the polls cheated, caught over and over again, election fraud all over the country. People say, well, Marine, Recon Marine, Martin, everybody. I'm going to get to you, I promise. John, go through and find out who's got to go the quickest right now, and I'll jam a few in, then we'll go to Nomi Prinz, and we'll get to the others, I promise. I will go to you while she's on with us. In fact, I'll just bring her on, introduce her, get her take on things, take your calls, okay? Monday through Friday, from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Central. Nomi Prinz, I don't know, back in the 2002, 2003, went public. She was a managing director at Goldman Sachs, spoke out about the derivatives fraud, the corruption, wrote best-selling books. She's a guest here from time to time. She's got a new novel out dealing with the Great Depression that dovetails what's basically we're about to go into here. And she joins us today, but we'll also be going to your